Hello again. Welcome back to the Daily Bread Bible Study. We are looking at day 53 for Saturday, February 22nd, 2020, Deuteronomy chapters 3 and 4. We're continuing what we picked up in Deuteronomy as we started it last time, as we were looking at what Moses has to say to God's people before they enter the promised land. And we see that it's pretty easy for them to be able to fight battles and win because God fights for them. But the harder task is living in the land that God calls them to live in, obeying the statutes and commands that God instructs. So we'll hear some of that in chapter 4 a little bit later. Moses picks it up in Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 3, saying, "So the Lord our God also handed over to us King Og of Bashan and all his people, and we struck him down until not a single survivor was left." They took the land from the Ammonites, but they removed the people as they were instructed to remove, so that way they would not be influenced by the people of the land and their gods. But their cattle, they said, Deuteronomy 3:7 says, "But all the livestock and the plunder of the towns we kept as spoil for ourselves." The idea that you get rid of the things that can speak to you and speak idolatry. One of the interesting things that's mentioned here is in verse 11, is it talks about King Og, and apparently it's mentioning that he has slept on a king-sized bed because he is part of a connection with some larger folk, is the idea that he may have some giant ancestry called Rephaim. Now only King Og of Bashan was left of the remnant of the Rephaim. In fact, his bed, an iron bed, can still be seen at Rabbah of the Ammonites. By the common cubit, it is 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. The reason I bring that up, I didn't even look to see how long, how 9 cubits across, how long that would be. And the size of the bed doesn't necessarily indicate the size of the individual, but I guess the idea is that he was just a very tall gentleman, and in a lot of ways they'll look at the Philistines and say the Philistines are giants as well too. But anyways, there was something specific in the context, and through my searching of the Rephaim in the Bible, I wasn't able to find anything. I guess, substantial. So, moving on. Moses then describes the areas the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the Manassites acquire. Moses also reminds these tribes of their commitment, that once they get the land, they have to continue to fight along with the other tribes who are going to fight for their land, because they are doing it as a peoples together. Deuteronomy 3:18 says, "At that time I charged you as follows: Although the Lord your God has given you this land to occupy, all your troops shall cross over armed into the vanguard of your Israelite kin." And with all the success in battle, then Moses, talking about all of this, gets excited for the people to come into the promised land and ask God if he can cross the Jordan. But God will not allow it for Moses. "At that time, too, I entreated the Lord, saying, O Lord God, you have only begun to show your servant your greatness and your might. What God in heaven or on earth can perform deeds and mighty acts like yours? Let me cross over to see the good land beyond the Jordan, that good hill country and the Lebanon." But the Lord was very angry with me on your account, and would not heed me. The Lord said to me, "Enough from you. Never speak to me of this matter again." So going back to when we were talking in Numbers, we mentioned that God got upset at Moses there at the waters of Meribah, the water from the rock, and we're not exactly sure what the cause of that was. We know that somehow Moses did not trust God, and it also seems to implicate too that the people of God and Moses not exercising trust in front of the people of God maybe led to him not being able to see the promised land. But anyways, we have it that Moses isn't going in. He's not going across the Jordan. He's going to die there on Mount Nebo. And Joshua will be the one that he is going to empower to lead the people into the promised land. But God says the best I can do is have you go to the top of the mountain and then look across and see into the land. Deuteronomy 4. Moses then advises the people, as the Lord charged him to give heed to the statutes and ordinances, neither adding nor taking anything away. This is to avoid slipping back into idolatry, which upsets God. Deuteronomy 4:3 goes into more detail. You have seen for yourselves what the Lord did with regard to the Baal of Peor, the false god of Peor. How the Lord your God destroyed from among you everyone who followed the Baal of Peor, while those of you who held fast to the Lord your God are all alive today. The statutes that will come, the statutes are important because, and especially in Deuteronomy, because they set the Israelites apart. And here we have Moses kind of giving some justification for why these statutes are very important to observe. So here's various verses from Deuteronomy chapter 4 that says, these statutes will also show your wisdom and discernment to other nations. It will reveal that a God is so near to Israel. It will also instruct you, and it'll help you to neither forget nor to let them slip from your mind, because the statutes are something that are important to remember, and you're called to neither forget nor let them slip from your mind. You're called to make them known to your children and to your children's children. And these statutes are ultimately for your well-being, as it says in verse 40. So one other thing, I'm just going to briefly mention this, and I'll talk probably more about this later, but this is a key point for us as Christians and for worship, is that Moses reminds them that they saw no form when the Lord spoke to you at Horeb, Mount Sinai, the Mount of God. So Moses interprets this as God does not want people to make any likenesses of God, or graven images might be another term for that. Idols is another term. But for us today as Christians, we have God revealed in Jesus, and Jesus was a human, and we often have a lot of pictures of Jesus around our places. And so we need to balance the desire to see God, especially through Jesus, with the idea that God is beyond anything, any likeness, or the likeness of anything, as it says in Deuteronomy 4:18. So thus, sometimes you will hear me reference God with the pronoun he. And I like using a personal pronoun to reference God, because I think God is very close. And he is my preferred pronoun instead of she or it. It's the language I grew up using, and I find it comfortable to use the pronoun he. But there is also a big danger in using the word he, because people may come to believe that God is a he, or that God is male, or that the attributes of he are the attributes of God. And that is not so. Now, the Lord is beyond male or female. It's beyond our capacity to define. And that's what God, or Moses, is trying to say of God. Trying to say that that God is beyond our capacity to define. So my preference is to avoid using personal pronouns at all. Sometimes in just the English sentence structure, it just becomes pretty redundant to say God and God and God. But I often just speak the word God when talking about God. I know it sounds funnier in English, but then you avoid the issues with conceptualizing God as just a he or a she or an it, to give God respect, but then also to be able to talk about God in the language and the sentence structure that we have in English. So there's my thoughts on that. I'm not going to critique you for what you use. It's just be mindful of the reverence of God, and that God is far beyond what we can put labels upon. So for Moses, this proper respect is important, especially since, as it says in Deuteronomy 4:27, the Lord your God is a devouring fire and a jealous God. That God cares very much what we think of him, but then also that God is, doesn't want false worship or idolatry to slip in amongst God's people. And that's, Moses is saying this over and over again because he knows that people are prone to worshiping other gods. But he wants to double down and even emphasize this more, saying, Moses then calls heaven and earth to witness against any idolatry from the Israelites, saying that the idolaters will be utterly destroyed. Deuteronomy 4:26. Picking it up in verse 31, because the Lord your God is a merciful God, he will neither abandon you nor destroy you. He will not forget the covenant with your ancestors that he swore to them. So even though we will do things that will make God upset, even though we will fall short of the glory of God, even though we might not always have the right conceptualization of who God is both jealous and merciful. God wants the people of Israel to be his own, but then also God is lenient and merciful in the midst of working with the people, and patient, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. And so God's mercy shows up in a lot of times, and we as Christians lean on the merciful side. We see God's gift through Jesus as part of that mercy, as part of that willingness to love us even when we are stuck in our sinful ways and our sinful habits. And so that way we are justified before God without having to do anything, especially Protestants, saved by grace through faith apart from works. But then we are called to live a different life because we have been justified by God, one especially in the Lutheran sense, as our vocation is to love our neighbors as ourselves, and to do that freely and openly. So moving on, Moses sings God's praises, asking, who is like God? As we heard a little bit before, he references some things that he finds incredible about God as the one who speaks out of fire and lets people live. This sounds awfully familiar to me in the Daniel 3 story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, as they are thrown by the king into the fire and yet go into the fiery furnace and are not harmed. This also, Moses sings praises about God as a God who delivers his people as he did against Egypt with many signs and wonders, and saying that other gods, or the false gods that other people worship, just don't have those stories. And ultimately claiming in Deuteronomy 4:35 that there is no other besides him, nor anything comparable to God, which is very true. So may we be able to live in the holiness of God and to remember that there is nothing like God, and we are called to worship God alone. So may you do well in that task and trust in God's mercy when that doesn't go quite exactly the way that we planned.